Good morning, everybody. Very briefly, I want to thank everybody for being here. I know that you all have other things you could be doing than covering the Minority Leaders Press Conference, but I do appreciate it because we have two supermajorities, we have a governor, but I think the minority's role in this process is very fundamental. We have to call foul when we see it, and hope that we have an opportunity to say it to you folks in here, and that maybe the public will have an understanding of what's happening in our institutions, and I'm grateful for that. But I want to talk a little bit this morning about what one of my fundamental roles is, and that's to prevent overreach from those who hold all the reins of power at this particular moment. And Speaker Bosma has said a lot of things about using discretion, about restraining impulses, about the two legislative majorities not doing everything that their instincts tell them to do. And I think the Speaker believes that. I think he means it. I'm not quite as confident that he has the ability to control all of his folks. That is easier said than done. And we've seen a couple matters emerge this week that ought to give us a little bit of caution and ought to give the public pause about what's transpiring here in these two particular chambers. Because every once in a while you get lawmakers that are over-exuberant. They think the world has been laid at their feet. They think that the public has blessed everything that they've ever dreamed of doing, and that's simply not the case. And I want to give a few tangible examples. The first is the continued murkiness of our budget process. A lot of sleights of hand could occur with the way we are now spending, collecting, and distributing money here in this state. When I use the word murky, I mean it's getting murkier than the Loch Ness Monster's lair underwater. What we now see is conditions where you have the General Assembly allegedly planning to appropriate dollars. They are going back and telling their constituents that they're doing all these wonderful things for them, and they know darn well that the chief executive has no intention of following what they suggested in the budget process. We saw that happen this week. We had an amendment on the floor of the House that would say, look, if you're going to give money to the Department of Child Services to protect kids from getting killed and abused and neglected, then spend those dollars where they were appropriated. That to me is sort of common sense. If you're going to cut them, then say you're cutting them. If you're going to increase them, then say that you're increasing them, why you're increasing them, and then use the dollars for those purposes. What we've seen instead, the dollars are appropriated. We talk about how we were champions for kids here in Indiana, and then the governor actually does nothing with them and uses them to pad surplus statements. That has to end. Now, I'm disheartened that amendment was voted down on straight party lines. But I'm going to continue to make that case. There has to be realism in the budget that is being passed. And that discussion needs to start now. And we're not talking about managing day-to-day operations and managing cash flow. We're talking about there being a discrepancy on one hand between what the legislature says it's doing and then the foreknowledge that it's not actually going to happen by the time it goes through the Play-Doh compressor of the executive branch. So that's one thing. The next area of overreach, we've already seen it. Redefining, stripping, whatever you may call it, the office of the state superintendent of its powers. Again, the people elected Glenda Ritz for a specific purpose. By the way, a lot of people voted for Glenda Ritz and Mike Pence. At least that's what the numbers would suggest. My guess is that when they were doing that, they thought that Glenda Ritz was going to get to do her job and Mike Pence was going to get to do his. And what we're seeing is a redistribution of those powers, sometimes to influential quarters, to live out the dreams of public education, private education, voucher education ideology that was dreamed up out in Washington. That can't continue, and we have to call them on that. We also saw matters, I know, Nikki, you were down there, down in our elections committee. Unfortunately, our Republicans, even though they hold all the reins of power again here in Indiana, they maybe sense that the demographics of the nation are slipping away from them. And the solution to that is to game elections in the future. That means making it harder for people to vote, taking away choices at the ballot box, moving polling places further away from where the voters actually are, through partisan means. That has to stop too, and they have to be called on it. And then finally, we have to add one matter of some success. We did see the, I don't know who dreamed up the term Prairie Pravda, but it allowed John Shorg to come up with some ingenious alliteration in a headline that he wrote this week, for which he deserves some praise. But that's something where, free institutions and people like me being able to call out, and also a number of Republicans as well, caused the governor to back down from what I'm confident he knew was a very unwise decision, increasingly indefensible. That's a good thing. But along with that, I think what is a little lamentable, we had something very important happen this week, and that was the approval of HIP 2.0. And I remember when this Public News Bureau issue came out, the first thing that came into my head, that's too bad, because actually stepping on Mike Pence's announcement of HIP 2.0 the very next morning. That's something that is a cause, probably not for cartwheels down the middle of the State House, but for some minor celebration. You had conservative Republican Mike Pence offer a method for insuring hundreds of thousands of people here in Indiana, working people, I might add, folks that are struggling, folks that might have a chance to go to a doctor instead of an emergency room. That's a good thing. And you had progressive President Barack Obama sign off on it with some modifications. I think that's good, and I've said all along, if you can get Mike Pence and Barack Obama to agree to something, you get Mike Pence to embrace parts of Obamacare here in Indiana, if you can get the president to say that's okay, Scott Pelath isn't going to say that's a terrible thing. I'm going to say nice things about it. Is it perfect? No. Are there going to be problems? Yes. But we've made the big decision. We're going to make the leap into the Affordable Care Act here in this state, and now we're going to work hard to make sure it works. There's going to be parts of it that work far better than expected. There's going to be other aspects that probably fail. And now we do the hard and practical work of solving those problems, and I think that's what the people expect of us. They want us to be a little less ideological and a little more pragmatic in problem solving, and I think the HIP 2.0 approval is going to give us the opportunity to do that. And that's something I want to wind up with on a positive note. That is cause for some praise. We'll have plenty of critiques coming up about the implementation, but that's okay. That's what we do here, and I'm glad for it. So with that, I'll be happy to entertain any questions about those things or a host of other unforeseen matters.
Scott, on the straight ticket voting hearing that took place this week, how does that help me out, disenfranchise voters? That's a term that popped up quite a bit. I mean, you can still vote straight Democratic or straight Republican, or in some counties straight Libertarian. You just have to go through and just look at each name to see who you're voting for, as opposed to just walk in and just press one button.
Well, one, I don't know what the motive is for taking away people's choices. That's a choice that's been there. It's worked. Both parties and independents have seen positives in it. And if you don't want, if you don't want to push that particular button for a straight party, you don't have to do that either. I know we do have problems with things like waiting lines at polls. We do have very short voting hours here in the state. We have a number of other barriers. It seems like we had to focus on breaking down the barriers to voting, as opposed to, again, thinking if there's new ways to try to take away people's choices and game the system. One area of argument, Abdul, that troubles me is that there's some assertion that if people are voting a straight ticket that they don't know what they're doing. I would submit they know exactly what they're doing. And by the way, let's look at one of the heaviest straight ticket voting counties here in the state.
Lake?
Well, Hamilton. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Lake is one, but one of the other ones is Hamilton County. But we all should know this demographically. The most educated county, based on degree, college degree, is Hamilton County. Lots of executives from Lilly live up there. Lots of captains of industry. Lots of other folks who have succeeded academically and done pretty well for themselves in this life. They are very heavy straight ticket voters. Now, a lot of it is straight ticket Republican, but so be it. So it's a little hard for me to understand some of the motives for that. And again, nobody has to vote a straight ticket. It's just yet another option. And it doesn't seem like that ought to be the focus of election reform. The focus on election reform ought to be ending the embarrassment of Indiana being 50th in voter turnout. That's what our focus ought to be, not just eliminating options.
On the issue of reversions that you were kind of alluding to, isn't there, but in terms of trying to rein in the governor's power there, isn't it also a concern that you want to give the executive some latitude when there's something like an economic downturn to play with the numbers?
Reasonable flexibility is reasonable. But when it becomes obfuscation, that's a problem. That's a problem for the public, because on one hand, you have lawmakers get to claim that they're adequately funding key services. And I think most people would guess that child protection is a pretty key service. So you get to argue on one hand, go back to your constituents and say that you really made that a priority. But on the other hand, you have the governor gets to claim that he's a genius fiscal manager. And you get to have it both ways. It's my job to make sure people don't get to have it both ways. You got to pick one or the other. And again, if you want to cut the Department of Child Services, then cut it. And say you're cutting it and say why. If you think the dollars aren't needed and when you use them somewhere else, say that. But this, I don't like to use cliches like shell game, but that's kind of what it is. You're getting to say you're doing one thing and you're actually in deepness knowing that you're going to have a completely different outcome. That's what has to change.
Back to the elections bill for a second, you alluded to the vote centers clause. That started up as a means of getting vote polling places closer to where people are. Is that the problem if it's taken statewide? It's going to have the opposite effect, you're saying?
Well, I think that's a fear. I mean, when you're taking away the bipartisan necessity of the allowance of vote centers, then you really have chance for some gamesmanship, because politicians know where the voters live. They're out there banging on doors. They walk through neighborhoods. If they don't like that particular group of voters, there's incentive to move the voting places further away and to inconvenience people. And again, I want to say, 50th in voter turnout. We need to get the politics out of electioneering. We need to, in a bipartisan way, agree that it's good for our republic to have more people voting. And if we proceed that way, no one can be accused of trying to use the laws in order to make the elections come out the way you want to.
Why do you anticipate problems with the implementation of HIP 2.0, and what problems do you anticipate?
I don't anticipate them. I calculate them. It is a human institution with human frailties, and everything isn't going to work perfectly. I think we should expect that and not fear it. And frankly, that was I think we should learn from the president's mistake, frankly. They believed that the Affordable Care Act was going to be rolled out without a glitch, and any sensible person would know that that's not usually the way things work. So I would just urge the public, if there's going to be a lot of good, there's going to be a lot of benefits, let's understand the good things that are happening and recognize those too. And if there are problems, let's not use that as a cause to instantly condemn the entire system. Let's try to fix them. So I guess what I'm really saying, Jim, is let's approach it with a can-do attitude.
Scott, to follow up on Jim's thing on HIP 2.0, early on, Democrats had criticized the governor, saying, hey, you should just go for traditional Medicaid expansion, not go the HIP 2.0 route. Apparently, Health and Human Services gave the governor's folks, I guess, almost like 98% of what they asked for if you do a comparison.
Right.
Did Democrats make a mistake in opposing HIP 2.0?
Well, first, I would submit that the governor's doing 98% of what the Affordable Care Act necessitates to begin with. So that argument certainly cuts heavily both directions. I think if you look back, Abdul, I called for the traditional Medicaid expansion because I thought it was the most prompt, and I thought it was going to not leave us with a year or two of people being left with nothing when they were already sending their tax dollars to Washington, D.C. But, I did say, look, Governor, if you can get your way to work, God love you. Well, he got his way to work. It took, again, a lot longer than I or many others would have hoped. But when you do have that sort of bipartisan consensus, I don't think it's right to just say, I'm going to continue to say, you shouldn't just continue to say it's a negative. It's an accomplishment. I think it's an accomplishment for both sides. And by the way, there's going to be criticism from both sides, and that's okay.
What do you think about all these religious freedom bills that have been filed, and where do you think that's coming from?
They're silly. They're silly, and they embarrass Indiana. Nikki, I wish I could elaborate more, but boy, I don't understand why people just can't help themselves. And we all know why those bills are around. You've got, and by the way, I've been mad about losing before. I have. And I've probably been accused of being a sore loser before. And that's maybe fair. I'm a human like anybody else. But some of these folks just can't let the marriage issue go. So they're dreaming up new ways to use it as a wedge, to placate some of the folks at home who are also angry about losing that particular issue. And let's leave it aside. We have so many things to work on with respect to economics, ensuring Indiana's current and future prosperity, that simply saying things, hoping you can get quoted on some, social conservative news outlet. Geez, just leave it be. And I hope Senator Long and Speaker Bosma understand that as well. That part of leadership is keeping that stuff at bay and keeping government focused on the center. And I think now those things are drifting beyond the fringes of the center.
You think some of those people who are pushing the religious freedom bill maybe have some unresolved issues of their own?
I'll leave that up to you, Abdul. You can go ask questions throughout the rest of the State House on that one. I don't have any idea.
What are your thoughts? Congress is going to vote next week to repeal the Affordable Care Act again. Presumably, Indiana's Republicans are going to vote to do that. A few days after they cheer the approval of HIP. Any thoughts on the hypocrisy?
It is hypocritical, and I suspect that they know they're being hypocritical. We all know how this story ends. Congress is good. The House is going to pass it once again. It's going to go over to a filibuster-proof Senate, and it probably won't even reach the president's desk. And if it did, we know what's going to happen then. So, look, the nation's already decided this. Nation isn't happy about all of it, but the decision's been made, and we govern better when we yield to practical reality and try to make the best of what we have decided. And now it ought to be about fixing problems and not just simply injecting our ideology into every single thing that happens.
Speaker said a couple of times that they wanted to not only put more money into the school funding formula than the governor proposed, but to rework how that's apportioned. How do you strike the appropriate balance? How do we get the right amount of money to the growing schools and the urban schools with some at-risk issues?
Well, that gets back to that budget transparency. First thing is you have to separate the three different school systems into three different pots of money. The traditional public schools need to be in a pot, the vouchers need to be in a pot, and the deregulated charter schools need to be in a pot. So that's the first thing. So we need practical honesty in the way we budget for those things. So you shouldn't be able to claim that you're giving a big increase to schools when a lot of schools are still going to be getting cut. The next thing we have to do is we have to remind ourselves that we once upon a time had an outstanding compromise. We had a balance in the distribution of school dollars with respect to at-risk kids who we know cost a little bit more to educate, and growing school corporations who we know need a few more teachers. We allowed schools to be able to phase out some of their fixed costs if they were getting cut, if they were losing students, and we shifted some of those dollars to the growing school corporations in a reasonable way. We can return to some of those things. They worked in the past, and you know what? More often than not, people liked it. But the first step is getting honesty in how we're budgeting for this stuff. Separate out the three different school systems, and then the public can see where the priorities are. most of the time the public will guide you in the right direction if they can see the numbers in front of them.
If having the school board elect their chair isn't going to solve the dysfunction in the school board, what do you think will?
They have the ability to solve the dysfunction themselves, and it starts with an end to the self-induced soap opera that's happened. I believe that drama's all been created by those who want to be able to say, wow, look at all this drama, we need to strip Superintendent Ritz of her powers. It just amazes me that those who have been given so many opportunities to govern Indiana and to shape policy are so paranoid about the presence of this one lone dissenter in their midst. Let her do her job and let the voters be the judge. It's not that complicated.
Should board members be elected and not appointed?
Well, I will say this, they know across the aisle that people want to be able to elect the superintendent. Now, it's been my experience, Governor Daniels used to talk about eliminating elected positions. I knew, just from listening to people at home, they like to be able to elect more. Now, whether it's going to lead to higher voter turnout or more participation, I don't know the answer to that. But the selection of the state school board, like we select local school boards, is an option that merits discussion. Probably something that merits even more discussion is sort of re-empowering the local school boards who have been stripped of a lot of their authority. We can't forget that people like their local schools and they like to make decisions about them, and they don't like these, specialty folks here in Indianapolis making all the calls for everybody. So that might be something to consider too.
Senate bill would give you an appointment, or at least one of them would. Is that the way to go, redo the appointment powers?
If granted it, I will exercise it, but I haven't asked for it.
But
So-
they've got like 3 different ways of reapportioning how the board is appointed. Does that need to be looked at, or?
I don't, I think all the talk about structure of the board is a distraction from the human behavior, which the humans themselves have the power to correct.
Should the governor have to replace those humans as part of any school board rearrangement? Clear the board and start over?
You know what? I think a change in scenery for a few may not be the worst thing.
But to piggyback on Eric's question about the school boards and et cetera, the legislation doesn't prohibit Glenda Ritz from being the chair. It just says that the board shall appoint a chair.
Well, they're right.
So couldn't Glenda, under that scenario, lobby?
Let me help, no.
Yeah.
Just like
Yeah, I think we know the answer to that question, Abdul, but I want to remind it, the people voted for Glenda to be the chair of that board, okay? When they voted for that office, that was part of the office's role. So, I just would, I just think that you have a lot of ideologically driven people who are members of that board, and Glenda just really bothers them because she's not as ideological, and she does have a lot of public education supporters who put her in office, and that bugs them. They've got plenty of tools here in this government. They control the whole budget process. They have a governor who has a few powers himself. They've got a couple other statewide officers that let you transfer money around when you want to. I just don't understand what more it is that they think they need. Well, with that, thank you, everybody.
Wait a minute, who are you picking Sunday?
Oh,
Winnipeg Blue Bomber?
The Seahawks.
With or without inflated balls?
Well, we'll see. By the way, the Chicago Bears equipment manager will be monitoring that.